Now, the interesting thing here is that the problem is not the access to private schools at all, but the level of fees, as I will illustrate in a comparative reference to Denmark. In Denmark, the fee for going to a private school is about 10% of the fee for going to a private school in Britain, for two reasons that are directly related to public finance, and which illustrates why public finance is so important. First is the low inequality of income, of course, which is largely a result of high and progressive taxation. And second is the high public subsidy of privately governed schools, which has meant that more than double the number of pupils in Denmark go to private school. So for instance, in Copenhagen alone, it's nearly 40%, compared to 7% in Britain as a whole. In the country as a whole, it's about 13%. So double the number of pupils actually go to private school, because private schools are highly subsidized by the state. The state, in other words, public finance, has contributed to extending choice in this case. Now, this graph is an illustration of the difference in teacher resources by students in state and fee-paying schools in a range of countries. And what you can see here is that the further under and away from the line, the more unequal the resources in favor of fee-paying students. What the graph illustrates is that the opportunity gap in education in Latin America is similar or worse to that which we find in Anglo-Saxon countries and the OECD. So there's a kind of structural similarity between the inequality of opportunity in Latin American countries and those and the Anglo-Saxon, most deregulated OECD economies. And this is a structural aspect of inequality that the basic income would not in itself address. Okay? That's important, I'll come back to that. But my next point is that this resource inequality in education, this material inequality, also shapes the distribution of work. This graph looks at the link between inequality in education and the access to paid work, or the returns that people get from paid work. So first, for school inequality, I use an index of 4 measures, including first, the relative share of teachers in state schools in relation to private schools, as in the previous graph. Second, state pupils' share of total resources, and total number of publicly funded students, and the overall secondary school attainment rate. Just to get a composite index, it tends to give us a more robust indicator, in this case, of school inequality. In relation to employment opportunity, on the other hand, I also use a composite measure, including, in this case, the absolute employment rate, the relative employment and income return rate of those with college as opposed to tertiary schooling. And finally, I consider these indicators for the population of women, a population which typically face much greater barriers of access to paid work. In this graph here, I'm using only 2 of the 4 measures in each index, which allows me to include more Latin American countries. The important point here is that a high income return rate to education is actually a measure of inequality. It's a measure of the concentration of opportunities and skills in the economy. Okay, for many years in OECD publications or World Bank publications, a high rate of return to education tended to be portrayed as a positive thing, but actually it's not necessarily a positive thing. It means that there is an elite that has concentrated, hoarded access to opportunities. So what I'm presenting here in this graph is the opposite. It's a measure of deconcentration of opportunities as a function of equal schooling. We can see a fairly similar pattern when we consider equal schooling measured in the same way, and the employment rate plus investment in training. And finally, an important indicator that's often mentioned in this regard is social mobility. In this case, the strong relation that we see between school equality and higher social mobility reflects the intergenerational redistributive impact of social insurance. In most of these graphs, we can see a very strong relation or a very strong position of the Scandinavian countries at one end of the spectrum and the Anglo-Saxon economies in the OECD and some of the Latin American economies at the other end of the spectrum. In that regard, and now bringing public finance into the equation, we can also observe a very strong tendency for higher levels and more progressive forms of tax to generate higher levels of public spending on services that allow individuals to balance and control their time. This is a very important aspect of the distribution of access to stability that I was talking about at the beginning. And the graph that I'm showing here depicts the structure and level of tax on the y-axis, again through a composite index of 3 measures. First, the upper marginal tax rate. Second, the distance between this rate and the rate paid by someone earning 67% of the average wage. And third, total tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. On the expenditure side, I take an equal weighting of the percentage of public expenditure and GDP on 4 things: education, training, income support, and childcare. Now, I've done an equal weighting so as to represent training and childcare, which are relatively small spending items in GDP, but that are very important in terms of the distribution of people's access to balanced time. Therefore, willingness to emphasize these types of spending, although they are fairly small spending items, I think illustrates political choice that is typical in redistributive, high social insurance welfare states in favor of giving citizens equal access to economic control. Okay, implications of this structural aspect of inequality for Latin America, and in particular the basic income debate. What are the implications? I think the implications for Latin America, where the inequality, the structure of inequality has very strong similarities, as I've shown, not complete similarities, but strong similarities with the Anglo-Saxon states, is to highlight the need to present the defense of the basic income in the context of a defense of a more strong redistributive state. 4 minutes. And I want to highlight 4 reasons. The first relates, first of all, to the unequal distribution of formal work in Latin America. This is a historical problem. Many scholars have argued in the more recent times that in the context of the expansion of cash grants, these grants will have little effect without public investment in, for instance, welfare services to reap the returns of the investment in education in connection with cash grants. Santiago Levy, for example, in his recent book, Good Intentions, Bad Outcomes, has argued that despite the poverty relief and the incentives that cash grants in Mexico have generated, the expectation that somehow formal employment would follow from this were unrealistic. And certainly this is represented, I think, counterfactually in the case of Brazil, where public subsidy has been required in order to reformalize work. It hasn't been enough just to redistribute cash grants, but you've had to have separate programs of public subsidy of formal employment. In this regard, we should also note that public investment in formal employment, in public employment, is strong systemic and much higher in what I refer to as social insurance states. As we can see, for example, in statistics, employment and health and welfare in Denmark is 34%, 19% in Sweden, 8% in the UK, 12% in Canada. There's a very strong systemic tendency or association between high social insurance and in public investment in this area of employment. So in this context, what I do worry about for Latin America concerns the areas of the anti-systemic discourse that I talked about before, libertarian discourse, which appears to agree with the neoclassical position that the concentration of formal work is an inevitable consequence of the rise of technology or of modern insecurity. You hear these arguments very frequently in basic income discourse nowadays. There's little we can do, there's little employment left, the basic income can solve the employment problem. Okay? To me, this seems especially dangerous for Latin America, where we know that neoclassical recipes have not worked, have not generated more formal employment. For instance, in Chile, although on the books there's more formal work, it's more precarious work. Okay? Relative income and return rates to education in Chile are half of those in Mexico. Chile also has a weak social insurance element in unemployment insurance, and it also has, in many ways, a less generous cash grant scheme compared to Brazil. And what this comparison shows, I think, is a much higher political commitment in Brazil as compared with Chile, an ideological and political commitment to redistribution that is similar to that reflects a similar difference as that between the UK and Denmark. And it shows that the choice that we face is not between contributory and non-contributory schemes, but between a low and a high tax nexus.